On today's episode of Uncommon Sense, I'll be interviewing James Matthew Wilson, the Cullen Foundation Chair in English Literature and founding director of the MFA program in Creative Writing at the University of St. Thomas. James is also a prolific poet and author. You won't want to miss this. Hello, viewers and listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Uncommon Sense. My name is Joe Grabowski, the Vice President for Mission and Evangelization here at the Chesterton Society. And I'm pleased to be welcoming on the program today an old friend, James Matthew Wilson, a wonderful poet and author and educator as well. Welcome to the program, James.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So as we were chatting before the interview, it's been quite a while, but I've been following your career with interest. And some of the folks tuning into the show might not be familiar with your work. So perhaps just introduce yourself briefly to the audience and kind of what drives your passion for poetry in particular.
Sure. Well, I'm glad to be on a Chesterton podcast because Chesterton's been such an inspiration for a lot of what I've written and done in my life and in my career. I think back to a book I published 7 years ago called The Vision of the Soul, Truth, Goodness, and Beauty in the Western Tradition, which was sort of the book that I wrote in order to understand what it was about the world that made it so fascinating and good, and why so much of contemporary thought had abandoned the wonder of being. And I wanted to start by mentioning that book because it begins with an anecdote that comes right out of Chesterton's Orthodoxy. In fact, the first one, the man who discovered England, who hated his homeland and decided to set sail, and then, unbeknownst to him, ended up washing up on the shores of that same place and discovered it for the first time. And I think so much of what I've been trying to do as a scholar and then as a writer is to help us all rediscover for the first time things that have become invisible to us, either because they're overly familiar or, as was the case in my own childhood and early education, things that have been hidden from us out of well-meaning foolishness. The great tradition from Homer forward, the joys of the Divine Comedy, the beauty of poetry that is in meter and that rhymes, that actually sounds good. All of these things are good things that, at least on my end, I had to rediscover and be educated into by a kind of self-remediation. So that's kind of been my career, and along the way, I've just written a bunch of books talking about all those good things that I've gotten to rediscover.
Yeah, it does seem to be an interesting kind of occupation of the modern era in poetry. You have obviously a lot of different trajectories that different poets take, but that interest in rediscovering that is so much a part of that anecdote by Chesterton, but even in his own poetry and in really in all of his writings, he's trying to call attention to the things that we maybe see so often we just take them for granted, or they're kind of just part of the background. And really the heritage of Christendom has become this for many of us, as you say, such that it's almost become hidden. But it also reminds me of, the preoccupation of, at least in his later career, T.S. Eliot even, right? There's that line from, is it Little Gidding, where we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive at the place we started from and know it for the first time, right? That rediscovery kind of drive is so much a part of Chesterton and indeed Belloc's writing, I think. Mm-hmm. So, perhaps, comment on that. I haven't. I'm ashamed to say I haven't read that book. I'm going to be picking it up. But perhaps comment on what you think kind of happened that we've gotten into the place where these things that are so basic in some ways need to be rediscovered.
Sure. Well, I'm gonna take a kind of odd path into that question, just because you've mentioned T.S. Eliot and Four Quartets,
Yeah.
uh, which is a poem that I think is a wonderful poem. In fact, it's Eliot's greatest poem. It may be the only of his poems that's so good that people will read it not just as a historical artifact, but as a truly great work 100 years from now. Um, and that poem, even though it has no direct quotation from or allusion to Chesterton, is a poem that's actually, my theory anyhow, is best understood in the context of Chesterton's legacy. And in fact, and so I want to answer your question by reflecting on that just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm going to say here is actually, believe it or not, pretty much the story that we tell in a class that we teach in my Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing at University of St. Thomas on the European Catholic Revival. In that course, and I think in one chapter of modern literary history, we actually have to begin by looking at an essay that T.S. Eliot wrote in the mid-1930s after his conversion to Christianity, and just a year before the death of Chesterton, now that I think about it, called Religion and Literature.
Mm-hmm.
And in that essay, he makes reference to Chesterton as a kind of propagandist for Christianity. And he doesn't mean that to be a deprecation necessarily, but Eliot was trying to figure out what the relationship between religion and literature was, because he sensed that there was something intrinsic rather than extrinsic that hold these two things together, but he wasn't quite sure how to approach the subject so as to make that argument. So he looks at different ways in which religion and literature might overlap with one another. People savoring the aesthetic beauties of the King James Bible, for instance. But as Eliot notes there, when people are only savoring the literary beauties of the King James Bible, you may be sure that the literary influence of the King James Bible is at an end, that it's as a sacred book that it informed our literature. And then he refers to Chesterton as one of those apologists or propagandists for the faith who writes knowing that he lives in a non-Christian civilization, but is in a sort of pugnacious way fighting to reclaim the territory and make that civilization Christian again. And Eliot says when other people do what Chesterton does, the results are very bad. So he admires Chesterton, but he is suspicious, you might say, of Chesterton's general approach, especially in the hands of the ham-handed.
Mm-hmm.
I've always thought that was a very kind of telling moment in his writing, because what I think Eliot was in fact trying to do as this great not just modern, but modernist writer,
Mm-hmm.
who was a convert to the faith, was trying to figure out what Chesterton was doing and how to do it in a way that it would be plausible and attractive to people who were not dispositionally sympathetic to either Chesterton's truth claims or his general way of speaking. And so I think the Napoleon of Notting Hill, for instance, is a great book. It's a wonderful book, but it's a book that even at the time it was written looked very unusual as far as novels were concerned. There's a lot of telling on the part of the narrator. The concrete details of the book are deliberately cartoonish and comic and sometimes grotesque, which works really well at certain passages, like when we go through the different stores trying to recruit them to the army of Notting Hill. We get all these wonderful comic details, mostly in hyperbole.
Mm-hmm.
But Chesterton's art there, marvelous though it is not a subtle art. And the 20th century novel, really going back to the 19th century with Flaubert and then Henry James, had moved to become a much subtler medium, so that Chesterton stood out as this, you might say, this strange yarn spinner in an age where people were not spinning yarns, but they were making finely filigreed carpets or patterns, to use a phrase from Henry James. So that made Chesterton seem kind of odd. and Eliot was in sympathy with the new, subtler, more austere version of the novel. And so, though he admired Chesterton's stories, and everybody loved the Father Brown stories, including among the high modernists, they
Mm-hmm.
couldn't get enough of detective fiction. Um, there was there was a certain doubtfulness that Chesterton was, as it were, the voice for the hour. And so you hear from Ezra Pound and some of the modernists sometimes slurs against Chesterton's achievement, and yet they can't leave him alone because he seems kind of important. And I think for Eliot, who eventually became entirely sympathetic to Chesterton's faith, he realized what had to be done, and that was to find a way to capture the joy, the wonder, the beauty of Chesterton's orthodoxy, but in the idiom of modern art. And so there are two great texts that I think realize that. One of them is, in poetic terms, is Eliot's Four Quartets, which is the great Chestertonian celebration of one's native place as the portal by which one enters into the kingdom of God.
Hmm.
And then the great novelistic achievement is Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, which is a truly, it's in Chesterton's spirit, but it's finding a way. Both the poem Four Quartets and Brideshead Revisited by Waugh are trying to find ways in which they can take the complete joy in being and beauty that Chesterton gives us, but recognize that something awful has gone on in civilization, and to register that to return to this beauty really is a hard fought rediscovery. These are kinds of things that Chesterton tends to push to the side in his sort of jovial style.
Yeah.
So, what one reason to emphasize that is that the modern arts in general have been such betrayals of the great tradition, but there is a strand, and a major one at that tried to maintain the tradition and just recognize that in the circumstances of the early 20th century, they had to find new and agile ways at once to respond to the spirit of the age, as it were, but also to hold on to and recover what had been lost. And
Hmm.
so I think Four Quartets and Brideshead are just great examples of that, where they really maintain the connection to the tradition that Chesterton was so responsible for also maintaining our connection with.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating to think of Chesterton kind of as this figure in the movement, but to his contemporaries, even though they were probably liable to find fault with him and criticize or find him guilty of artifice, and some of the people that review him in the papers at the time do that, but then you have people like Shaw and Wells who, because they knew him, they kind of saw the full package. And that's the one thing about Chesterton. I don't know that Chesterton, and this is fitting, for one of the core pieces of his philosophy. He doesn't work well in isolation, in the sense of like parts of him can't be really separated from the whole. You kind of do need to take the whole package, and when you take the whole package, then I think it becomes clear, but you can't read The Man Who Was Thursday in isolation from orthodoxy and get it. And I think if you read orthodoxy and then The Man Who Was Thursday, it'll actually cast light upon orthodoxy, even though orthodoxy as an essay, I think, is very much intact, and it has a wholeness to itself. But I'm fond of saying, and it's only a little bit hyperbole, I think, that all of Chesterton is in all of Chesterton, in the sense that he's continually hammering in on the same ideas. He seems sometimes even, frankly, to repeat himself, but in new and fun ways, and that's part of the joy of reading him, is that there's this consistency of mind there. So
Yes, I think so. Since I've already raised Eliot, well, I guess I'll hold you responsible for that. I'll
yeah.
mention him just one more time. In one of his late essays, and I'm forgetting, is it what is a classic, or is it major and minor poetry? Probably the latter. But in any case, Eliot raises the question: what's the difference between the major poet and the minor poet? And the minor poet, he says, is the poet who for this or that particular poem, which we might find in the poetry anthology, we appreciate him. But the major poet, and for him and for all of us, I suppose Shakespeare's the great example. You don't just read one isolated work and stop there. You read all of the work, and not just for the sake of its consistent quality, but rather because there's a larger whole, a personality or a character that comes to appear before us as, you might say, a final work that transcends the sum total of all the works together.
Mm-hmm.
So we read Shakespeare's 36 plays, but we don't just read them as a succession of plays. We read them as capturing this character of Shakespeare, this myriad-minded figure. Similarly with Homer, you can't help but wonder a little bit about who Homer was, as people have never failed to inquire.
Mm-hmm.
In reading both the Iliad and the Odyssey, and wonder what else might have once existed attributed to that poet. And Chesterton's one of those major writers for that reason, that as the more one enters into his work, the more you see the work as a constellation, as individual stars that are forming a whole bigger than, larger than the sum of their parts. And that's why you can have something like a Chesterton Society. If he was just a minor poet, if he was just an anthology piece writer, then there wouldn't be that they're there to celebrate. Just thinking of poetry, as a poet, Chesterton is a minor poet, but he is a poet of great importance, because he kept something alive that Eliot and others had allowed to disappear from the tradition, at least for the time. And that's Eliot and the early 20th century poets, they brought over from the novel an attention to the minute prosaic detail. And and they resurrected from the 17th century poets, John Donne and Herbert and others, and not to mention Shakespeare's dramatic poems, in attention to, or the use of the precise word, sometimes a neologism, to capture the sort of texture of experience and to explore it even. Those are qualities that are not entirely absent in Chesterton, because they couldn't be entirely absent, but they're minor in comparison with what his real virtue is. And his real virtue is continuing the 19th century tradition of celebrating the strong beat of poetic rhythm, of keeping poetry's connection to music and song alive. And when we take those two things together, the attention to the minute, as well as the love of poetry as a medium, both of perception, but also as a great rhythmical medium, and necessarily a rhythmical medium, that's where we have the whole poetic tradition intact together. And so if it weren't for Chesterton and Belloc and Thomas Hardy, and a number of other figures, but I think Chesterton, Belloc, and Hardy are among the foremost of them, a whole great line that is an essential line of the English poetic tradition would have been lost in the 1910s and 20s.
Well, let's pivot now to poetry, because I know that you as we mentioned in the introduction, are yourself a poet, but I think in our email exchange, you said maybe you'd want to share some insights on particulars of Chesterton's poetry, but also maybe share some of your own poetry with us, which I think it's a welcome change from what most of our folks are going to get on YouTube. And I've just been appreciative of seeing interviews that you've given around, and as I said, as your essays pop up in different places of kind of carrying that torch, which really we don't have too many banner carriers in our lifetime that we can celebrate, especially within the Catholic ethos of just being champions of poetry. I think of Dana Gioia, for example, perhaps, and Joe Pierce has written I think extensively on this, but it's good to just to hear somebody identify themselves as a poet who isn't just well, I mean, you don't have bongos and a beret and some sort of weird cheroot and things like that. It's not the kind of modern stereotype. And the other thing that is so many people that just blatantly call themselves poets nowadays, it's hard to discern that what they write is actually even poetry. So I appreciate the difference in you. But yeah, any insights, particularly on Chesterton's poetry, that you'd like to share, or do you want to just jump into sharing some of your own?
Oh, I've got to talk about Chesterton a little bit because I want to capture some of those great aspects of his experiment with rhythm, or
Yeah,
his
please.
maintaining tradition. Here's these are poems that probably are among his best known, but uh, and so they may be very familiar to your listeners, but I just think they require a little recitation. That just from the Rolling English Road, which
Mm-hmm.
is speaking of the man who discovered England. I love the idea of the drunk finding his way home leads to the creation of the winding road through the country. Before the Roman came to Rye or out of Severn Strode, the rolling English drunkard made the rolling English road. Just great. And then a little tweak at the French Revolution in the next stanza. I knew no harm of Bonaparte and plenty of the squire, and for to fight the Frenchmen I did not much desire. But I did bash their bragonets because they came arrayed to straighten out the crooked road an English drunkard made. Just that's my kind of counter-revolutionary
Yeah.
poetry. But that long 14er line, um, which is the basis of the ballad line and the traditional ballad in English, and Welsh and Scots for that matter, is now there are great poets, contemporary poets, writing the ballad line, but at one point almost nobody was using this, and so Chesterton was because it had come to seem nostalgic, romantic, and cliche, but it
Mm-hmm.
and so the beauty of it, of the strong rhythms, were thrown away because a lot of poets thought that they couldn't take those rhythms and use them for more contemporary purposes, you might say. But Charles Causley, who's deceased now, but for many decades was one of England's best known poets. Causley wrote mostly in the ballad form, and on English subject matter. So it was a great debt to Chesterton. Lepanto, which is I find it to be such a strange poem, so odd, and I mean rhythmically, but it's worth at least getting. One of my favorite lines from late in the poem: the Pope looking out to see at where the Battle of Lepanto is taking place. The secret window, the secret window whence the world looks small and very dear. I love that. The vision from the window of the Sea of Peter is what sees the world as small and very dear. And then, since I have this anthology piece open, here's just an excerpt from a song against grocers.
Mm-hmm.
God made the wicked grocer for a mystery and a sign, that men might shun the awful shops and go to inns to dine, where the bacon's on the rafter and the wine is in the wood, and God that made good laughter has seen that they are good.
Mm.
Wonderful, again, use of the ballad stanza. And that kind of reminds me of that moment that I referred to earlier in Napoleon of Notting Hill, where Chesterton captures the romantic spirit of the English shop, and in this case, the inn, something I entirely share because there's nothing that gives me more pleasure than going out to dinner and ordering food rather than making it. I know you're a big cook, Joe, but
Yeah.
and ordering beer rather than pulling it out of the refrigerator. There's just
Oh
such
yeah.
festivity in sitting down to dine and being served in a restaurant, that it's something not to be taken for granted, especially in this age of or in the aftermath that we're living in after the shutdowns in 2020.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great. I appreciate so much of that style that you share, the Chesterton kind of exercise, and how it if it feels outdated to modern readers, I think that it's a crucial insight that you bring out, that it was, in a certain sense, no less seemingly anachronistic in his own day, and that is part of the point. So it actually becomes an opportunity for us to be able to appreciate Chesterton without as much remove as we might think that we have from his era. You know, there's I think a tendency sometimes for people to feel very alienated, that, well, everything just seems so old timey and stilted, even in some of his prose essays and things like that. But that's just Chesterton. That's the point I try to get across to people. Like, it's not. Don't think of it as though it would have been less challenging necessarily to read some of his stuff in the contemporary papers for readers of the Illustrated London News. You know, Chesterton just has a certain kind of style and a certain kind of seemingly meandering way of getting to a point, but it's nonetheless sure, right? It's he is sort of drunkenly pursuing the rolling English road, but the road is going somewhere, and you just kind of have to be patient with it until you get there, and enjoy the journey along the way. So
Yeah, what's been great in recent decades, I just published a poem by A.M. Juster in the last issue of Modern Age magazine. Juster, I do this. A lot of contemporary poets use the ballad measure, and for the most part, we try to take that traditional meter and to make it sound as contemporary as possible, not by messing with the meter or rhyme, but by making sure that the idiom, the voice, the style is a contemporary style. But the great joy of working that way is that if you can have something that sounds very contemporary, most of the time there are moments where you can snap to and return to this kind of great rattling rhetoric, such as we find in Chesterton, and it, and it's a deeply satisfying rhetoric where we hear the spoken voice breaking into song, which is what ballads are always on the cusp of doing.
yeah.
Let me give you an example, and I don't know if this is the best example, but from my most recent book of poems, I'll hold it up for your readers, is St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, which is just coming out this month from Word on Fire. And in there, I wrote a hymn to St. Philip Neri, who what impressed me in studying about his life, reading the different saints' lives about him, was actually, and I think this is what attracted Newman to him as well, is how Chestertonian he was. That he was he liked to appear like a fool because he didn't want any pretensions. He loved practical jokes, and this was in this last quality is one that Newman specifically mentions when he explains why he had his oratorian vocation, that Neri would just sit in his cell and receive heart to heart his guests and listen, but also would listen with such deep attention that his response would always be sure counsel. So in a very Newman spirit, I wrote this poem, By That Heart Known, and following a lot of the things that Chesterton does in his poetry. This is in the meter, the stanza form of Who Would True Valor See, which is one of the best loved English hymns, although we Catholics know nothing about it, but Anglicans just love that. And at Margaret Thatcher's funeral, everybody broke into song with that hymn, which I would imagine it would take a lot to get a contemporary English person to sing at Mass, but it worked there. And I try to recapture the spirit of Neri here, that in a way I think that will make his character sound very familiar to Chesterton admirers, I should say. The young man in his cell receives his guest, who all his heart should tell and leave there blessed. In quiet company we shall a marvel see, as every thought shall be by that heart known. To Rome the pilgrims came, poor as God chose them. He calls to each by name, he serves and knows them. Then with his friends he'll stray along the Appian way, in lively talk and play, his sweet grace sown. With all who roam the street, the saint would tarry, Each sorrow he should meet was soon turned merry. Yet he prayed with the dead in their stone-chambered bed, till flames his great heart fed and his life grown. Who is this fool, they jeer? He won't reply, for that's how he'd appear, so to deny all claims to holiness, which are vain weights that press on one who'd simply bless poor hearts alone. For him it was such ease to turn to God. His joyful jest would cease and his head nod, as he passed far beyond the world of which we're fond, and freed from every bond his heart was flown. Who stirs the old man's room finds him in prayer, but with his laughter's bloom leaves pain and care. Into his company the great and wretched flee, as in this oratory we are his own.
Wow, I like it. I love. I guess I was trying to. It's always difficult simultaneously to do scansion, right? But I was it was in my mind trying to figure out. But I guess it's the C rhyme, the common line at the end of each of the or the
Yeah.
common rhyme at the end of each of the stanzas. I love that. I love that feature as it for me anyway. It has that effect of really. Well, to use like a cooking analogy, it's like a aperitif, right? It gets you like you want to get back into that rhythm. It has and to return to the ballad at the end of each verse. It makes you want to go on to the next one, if that makes any sense.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. You have it really functions as kind of the D rhyme functions as kind of a refrain line. By that heart known, his sweet grace sown.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in the John Bunyan Pilgrim's Progress hymn, he who would true valor see. That's where that hymn originally comes from, is in Pilgrim's Progress. If I'm recalling correctly, that does have an actual refrain. But I wanted to have each line be a variation on the language of the heart, and to capture different aspects of Neary's personality. Then this poem was actually originally written as a commission by a supporter of and a great enthusiast for the Oratorian order. Mm-hmm. And so this was actually originally written for the Oratorians of Toronto in Canada as a gift to them. So that's why it ends with, and we are, as in this oratory, we are his own, to remind the contemporary Oratorians of their vocation and their attachment to Neary. That's great.
If you don't mind, this is off topic a little bit. Not well, really on topic, but out of order maybe. I should put a plug in here for anyone listening or watching at this point, that if that intrigued you, one of the talks at the Chesterton conference this summer is going to be on the likenesses, especially in the spirituality of Chesterton and St. Philip Neri. So if you have not yet registered for the Chesterton conference in Philadelphia in July, please join us for that. You could tune in online if you're unable to make it in person. We have a very affordable digital pass to the conference. So, but that's just one of the great talks that you'll be able to hear. And
I would have come just for that. So.
Yeah, yeah. I when I heard it, and the speaker in this case, I won't say who yet because we haven't released the official schedule yet, and I guess it's always subject to change. But this was one of those where the speaker just came to us with that. It wasn't necessarily what we had anticipated being talked about, but the moment I heard it, I thought, oh, that's great. That's something so needed, because of course part of our apostolate is trying to establish that Chesterton did have, a pattern of holiness and spirituality in his life that can actually be discerned and identified, contra those who somehow think that, he didn't. I won't name names, but so we'd like to help establish that. And I think by putting him in conversation with an acknowledged saint who had the similarities just jump off the page once they've been pointed out to you, which is great. Mm-hmm. So,
yes, I think that's, as I said, I'd come for that alone, because I think there's a lot to be said on that subject.
There is, yeah. I mean, that could be the theme of a future conference, actually, a future Chesterton conference. So, sorry, I'm interrupting, but yeah, how about do you have any other pieces that you might like to recite for us? Because
Yeah,
I enjoyed that.
I've got to give you another one, another Saint poem. This is actually the title poem from the book, St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds.
Oh, great.
As I think I mentioned to you this morning, I certainly did not write this poem with Chesterton in mind, at least not consciously, but you'll hear early on. I must have. I mean, first of all, because I've always loved Chesterton's book on Aquinas.
Mm-hmm.
But second of all, there are several moments in this poem where this is practically the ox of God as Chesterton depicted him. I'll just note that the middle passages here are all, this is a poem in heroic couplets. The middle passages of this poem are all straight out of the Summa Theologica and just put into heroic couplets. So this is as close as you're ever going to hear to a verse translation of Aquinas' Summa. Of course, you can read verse translations of Aquinas' poems all you want, but here's the Summa becoming poetry.
Nice.
So this is St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds. Beyond the window, morning sparrows made their song as if the whole world's goodness paid its plenty out for them and them alone. The old saint heard their joy and squelched a moan as his legs, stiff and heavy still with sleep, arranged themselves beneath his cassocked heap of belly. Where had he left off before? He asked his three amanuenses, more for their sakes, sprightly fingers, sluggish minds than his. One said with the forbidden kinds of birds, and what their figures signified for Moses, who charged the eagle's flight with pride. Aquinas sat a moment, mind withdrawn from his mouth's taste of buttered loaves, the dawn without, the wish for more wood in the fire to clear the frost from stone or to admire the cool, swift brilliance of all he said, as a swan plumes its white and well-turned head. He spoke. The long-beaked ibis feeds on snakes to represent the man whom nothing slakes. Feasting upon dead bodies' open gore, the vulture stands for all who thrive through war. When Noah let the raven out to fly, it never did return to signify such men whose souls are blackened by foul lust, or who, unkind, won't pay back trust with trust. The plodding puffball ostrich is that which figures all those weighed down with growing rich, and hearing God's call plant their soiled head. Plovers, like gossips, on stray words are fed. And who, on seeing the gull, does not admire that its bright wings to heaven may aspire, and yet it wastes its hours adrift at sea, gorging on fishy sensuality. The hoopoe builds its nest on heaps of dung, just as despair's eyes view the world all wrong. He paused then, at the thought of earthly sorrows, our sickly past, incarnadine tomorrows, the myriad things that whistle arcane truth to please old minds and to instruct raw youth, and bore down on his broken knees to pray for such a world that had so much to say.
Wow. That's great. And, this is twice now that in experiencing the poem, and maybe this is because I'm inattentive by nature. I'm not, but so I don't know what it is, but there's something about, in particular, your poetry, although I do find it sometimes when especially listening to other great poetry recited, is that, my mind likes to almost wander, almost kind of let the music of the poetry not become background per se, but the illusions are so rich there, and so I was simultaneously trying to in my mind remember my Summa and try to think like what question might this be from, these lines about the animal natures, but then the illusions themselves, like the imagery. So it's I think that's a sign of a very effective poem, in that the richness of it is kind of multifaceted, that it kind of guides you into different aspects of reflection and musing.
Yeah, when I was, I read the Summa in the morning after prayer, and this was going back 6 or 7 years now. I was in the treatise on law, and I came across Aquinas' discussion of the birds that were forbidden for consumption by the Mosaic law. And I just, as I read through it, I just stopped and I said, I don't know what's going to happen next, but I'm going to copy this passage out, and then I'm going to put Aquinas's explanations for why the birds are forbidden into heroic couplets, and I'm just going to let it go.
Mm-hmm.
Like, as in, if that's all I do, I'm completely content with that. I just want to hear how it would sound to recite these interpretations in verse. But as soon as I did it, I've lived with Aquinas for a long time, and I just I felt myself, uh, it, you know, well, imagining this life and the practice of dictating to his amanuenses every morning. He'd
Yeah.
have three of them, which I think is wonderfully Trinitarian, but he really literally did have three of them. And as it happens, one of my old roommates, who was a Aquinas scholar, one of my roommates from graduate school, I was visiting him years after I had finished graduate school, and he showed me a huge blow up image of Aquinas's script and took me
Mm-hmm.
through the Latin shorthand so I could, the paleography of it, so I could appreciate how the writing worked. And so it was great. I mean, I this was years and years ago that he did this, but it had never left me. And so then when I found myself putting myself sort of in the persona of Aquinas a little bit, that great experience of seeing the actual dictated script it came back to me, and I found myself sort of in the cool passages where Aquinas was writing the Summa.
Yeah, it's a perfect. Gosh, I mean, again, the effectiveness of the poem, because it was sort of. I was immediately put in mind of that just famous kind of image of St. Thomas, and I don't know the painter, but it's frequently the image on the cover of I think it's the Dover paperback edition of St. Thomas Aquinas by Chesterton, where it's just he's visibly a little portly in the face. It's just a facial profile, and he's kind of looking pensively off, and immediately kind of that image. And then I saw it sort of in like a cell, where the monks might be working with, limited light coming in, kind of a dark place, and the three robed scribes sitting there in front of him. Quite a compelling image. So
it shapes the whole theme of this book, because the theme that I was working on in this book was the affirmation of the goodness of form, especially poetic form, not despite, but specifically in the face of the evil we encounter in the world. So this poem, for instance, appears in the book immediately after a poem about the Dresden bombing called "Waking in Dresden," and it's a response to the mass atrocities of the last century, and then within that theme, and this is, I think, kind of always my perennial theme, but it's Chesterton's too, I think, and I'll just give you the last two lines of the poem one time. And bore down on his broken knees to pray for such a world that had so much to say. And it's the way in which the world speaks to us, that it speaks to us not just in the tongue of the literal, but also in the symbolic and the spiritual, so that to see the world whole, you actually have to enter into the mystery of things and into their depths and their interior significance. That's, of course, at the heart of Chesterton and the man who rediscovers England. And it's also one of the great achievements of the Christian Middle Ages, whether it's in Dante's allegorical and symbolic poetry, in Aquinas's great theology, or in another kind of text that's related to both of them, though we wouldn't normally associate it with Aquinas, and that's the medieval bestiary, where the authors reflected on, what is the meaning of lion, what the lore about lions, and how do they speak, and what do they do, and what do they represent. That kind of perceiving of nature as an allegory is actually the correct and apt way to perceive the world. The challenge, and I think this goes back to the beginning of our discussion, is to make that compelling and convincing for an age that has long since inclined to think of the things of this world as just so much extended matter subject to our quantification and control.
Yeah, and well, it is indeed such a hallmark of Chesterton's viewpoint and spirituality that, you know, he not only viewed nature that way, but really the entire cosmos of created things. You know, it's a line at least attributed to him, and Dale would know if he were here, and I should know, but he it's attributed to Chesterton. Whether or not he actually said this, the sentiment is Chestertonian, that there's no such thing as an uninteresting subject, just an uninterested person, you know.
Yes.
And that's his big critique. He finds everything fascinating, and he says not only does he find everything fascinating, but truly in his sort of, I would say, though he was very much a Thomist, his Franciscan spirituality, part of the reason everything was fascinating is because everything is in the Word. You know, Saint Paul tells us this. All of creation is, you know, in the Logos that comes forth in the processions of the Trinity. And so, really, yeah, he's finding in everything. And he says somewhere like even the binomial theorem. You're still kind of talking about Christ, right? So, well, James, we better wrap up. We've gone a little long here, but I think this was a pleasure. We'll have to have you back another time for our viewers and listeners. But in the meantime, where can they go online to find out more about you and find some of the things you've written?
Yeah, so I have a website, which is just my name, jamesmatthewwilson.com. And if you're interested in picking up a copy of St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, Word on Fire does have it available for what's officially pre-order, although I'm told that it keeps showing up at people's doors, even though it's not officially released yet. And I know my publisher and my children would be grateful if you buy a book so that they can eat.
Very good. Well, we will put a link we will put links in the show notes, and you'll probably see them popping up on the screen here in the YouTube cards if you're on YouTube. So do that. Do go buy one of James's books and share it. Read. I think you saw today something that we have too little of nowadays. Reading poetry is great, but getting together and reciting poetry, having poetry read out loud, I think is a great exercise. So, well, again, James, just a pleasure catching up with you. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Joe. Really appreciate it. It's great to see you again.
Likewise. And to all of you, viewers and listeners, great to be seen by you. And we hope that you will please like this video, leave us a comment, share it with your friends. All these things help YouTube know that this is interesting content that they'd want to put in the feed of others. You can also help us out by hitting the subscribe button and signing up for notifications so that you become made aware when we have live events going on. And we will have a live series coming up. We'll reveal more about that in the near future. So stay tuned here. The only way that you can be sure that you find out when it's coming up is to hit that subscribe button and sign up for the notifications. Thanks for tuning in again. And until next time, remember, Chesterton is always better with friends. God bless.